Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Where to Start, a webinar for energy communities, starting a transformation. My name is Briggs White. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities and Economic Revitalization. It'll be my pleasure today to be your moderator. Today, we are going to start off with an icebreaker. So why don't we go ahead and pull that up, and we'd just like to learn a little bit more about where you are around the country so that we can help guide some of the conversation a little bit later. Again, we have options of these different regions as well as item G, other, which you can actually put into the chat. If you would, so please do take a moment just to let us know where you're coming from. And again, a hearty welcome to today's webinar. We hope the information is really useful. So let's review the agenda while folks are filling that out. We're going to have some opening remarks by Brian Anderson, the Executive Director of the Interagency Working Group, as well as the Director of NETL, DOE's National Energy Technology Laboratory. Then we're going to have our keynote presentation by John Grossens from the Environmental Protection Agency, which will really walk through when an energy community is first finding out about the potential for a closure or a transition in their community, really how to get started, which is the intent of the webinar here today. But then importantly, we're going to illustrate some of those principles first by Kurt Oldfield of Spoon River College in Illinois, who will talk about workers in transition, as well as Jerry Roll from the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky, who will talk about capacity in certain rural communities, as well as philanthropy and some other aspects, and illustrate some principles. We're reserving a decent amount of time towards the end for Q&A, so please do have your questions ready. And in fact, we received a few really good ones already during the registration process for this event. And then we'll go ahead and conclude. Everyone will be started off in a muted mode, but please do use the chat in order to contribute to the conversation. As a notice, this meeting is being recorded, and let us know if you do have any either technical issues or otherwise. So why not? Oh, and then as a final announcement, slides and the recording will be posted afterwards to energycommunities.gov, the website where you presumably registered for this event, as well as we'll send out an email blast after the event. So you'll get a copy of the slides and access to the recording when that's been made available. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at the results from the first poll and see where everybody's coming from. So nearly half of our attendees are from the Appalachian region. So great to see a strong response there. But we do have some folks from the Northern Rocky Mountain area, as well as it looks like maybe a handful from the Illinois Basin. So really strong Appalachian contingent here on today's call. So thanks for attendance. All right, and next we're going to transition to Dr. Brian Anderson, who's going to kick us off with some opening remarks. Brian Anderson, again, is the Executive Director of the Interagency Working Group, as well as the Director of NETL. And with that, Brian, why don't you go ahead and take it away.
Briggs, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who's joining us today. You're either, likely fall into one of two categories. You're either someone who is in a community who is either facing or has seen economic transition in the energy sector, or you're somebody who wants to do something about that. And so I'm hoping that today's webinar is directly supporting your desires. We in the Interagency Working Group across all of our 11 agencies are passionate about making a difference in communities around our country, those communities that are seeing economic transition due to a transition in the power sector, a transition in the energy sector as a whole. And we know certainly, as illustrated by the poll, about half of those who responded from the Appalachian region. We know that many communities across Appalachia are facing and have been dealing with economic transition or transformation over the last couple of decades. So I'd like to take a few minutes to share with you today some information about the mission and the activities of this Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities and Economic Revitalization. talk about some specific resources that are available to you, falling into potentially one of those two categories or anybody else. So that you know, our mission is to promote job-creating investments in communities that have been impacted by coal mine or power plant closures, and for us to be proactive, investing in those communities now that would likely be impacted by additional near-term declines in coal production or generation from coal-fired power plants. We have a number of priorities, but first and foremost is to catalyze investment across the federal government with urgency, and then secondly, and really also primary, is to engage with folks who are on the ground directly so we can help simplify and even demystify the federal government process and the application process for funding, and ultimately to create a centralized one-stop shop clearinghouse for energy communities so you can access online resources across the federal government. And there'll be more to that. I'll give you a teaser there. So I want to tee up a short brief video offering some context for this discussion today. So if we can start that video. So I know on my end I had a little bit of a disconnect from the audio, but I think you could pick up and we will discuss the mission of the Interagency Working Group. And so in that initial report, again, 60 days after January 27th, after the signing of the executive order, the report identified 25 priority communities across the country based on, in the first initial tranche, based on the the current employment in the coal sector, based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so there were these communities, some of them are large non-metropolitan areas as defined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Other are smaller communities, but it is the set of communities across the country that have the largest dependence on coal mining, and power plants for their tax base and employment base. The next iteration, as we are continuing some analyses, are on the tax base supplied by mining of coal and oil and gas resources, and how those contribute to the community's livelihoods across the country. So these communities are ones in which our first round of stakeholder engagement has focused, so we can hear directly from folks that are affected by the energy transformation, so we can take into account the stories and the needs and desires of the communities to chart their own path forward. And so if you go to the next slide, what we're trying to do is identify, as noted in the video, federal programs across all of the 11 agencies involved in the Interagency Working Group, and potentially even those outside of the 11 agencies, but very specifically bringing together those federal programs that resulted in potentially available funding of over $38 billion. The prioritization is for those funds to go into immediate investments in energy communities. There's grant funding for infrastructure projects like roads and broadband, water and sewer system, local transportation, also capitalizing on technology advances so we can prepare traditional energy economies with their existing infrastructure for the clean energy economy in the future. There's also financing and grant funding applications. There's also programs for remediation of abandoned mine lands and orphaned oil and gas wells, mine impacted water and brownfields, and for small businesses, so we can really support the businesses that are in communities to create the local economic infrastructure that is necessary for economic revitalization. We are pleased to say that our IWG agencies have already awarded $2 billion to energy communities thus far. This is money that has been out the door, that is already in communities where it's needed most, and we are really just getting started. And so on the next slide are some areas of focus for us, and is how we can upgrade the infrastructure. So our communities around the country absolutely deserve access to reliable broadband. It's a backbone infrastructure of today and tomorrow. Good roads, clean water, modern sewer systems, and affordable local transportation. We know that some of the communities that have already been affected by economic dislocation. When it comes to the infrastructure, they were built for larger populations than those communities have today. And sometimes in sewer systems, it's hard to keep the sewer systems operating at lower population levels. There's also a tremendous opportunity for us to leverage environmental cleanup, bringing the communities into lower legacy environmental footprints, deploying low carbon technologies, simultaneously creating jobs and building the infrastructure to utilize potentially brownfields or abandoned mines for economic development in the future. We also want to support our local entrepreneurs. And communities need thriving small businesses that drive innovation and support local jobs, and for them to engage with local institutions and nonprofits and to stand up innovation hubs in our energy communities. And then lastly, and certainly not least, is how we support training programs for the workforce of the future, aligning the training programs for the jobs that will be there. And that is one of the key aspects of workforce development, is to simultaneously develop the new jobs and train the workforce of the future. So the next slide, I have a quick announcement. I'm excited to say that we've unveiled some new resources today on our IWG website. You can find it at energycommunities.gov. You can follow us on the social media channels. But what we're building, and I mentioned it before, was the one-stop shop for communities like yours and the communities that you support, so that all those resources that we have across 11 agencies, $38 billion, 60 different federal funding authorities, so that they're in one place. And so there are some new resources unveiled today. If you go to energycommunities.gov, on the tab resources, you can see some of those that we've put together for you. And then on the last slide, there is a call to action for everyone. Every time we meet with stakeholders and those interested, we want to hear from you. And I cannot stress this more. There have been efforts in the past to coordinate across the federal government. There have been efforts to revitalize energy communities in the past. And one thing that we're trying to make sure we're doing potentially differently this time than have been tried is to make sure that this is built from the ground up. We are trying to align the federal resources to catalyze the efforts that are going on in your communities around the country, which is why we wanted to have this webinar today on where to start as an energy transforming community. So please sign up, provide us input today, tomorrow, whenever it comes to mind. You're hitting stumbling blocks in reaching the federal agencies and the IWG and finding the right resources for your community. Reach out to us. We want to understand how we can better engage with stakeholders, how we can target the federal investments, and how we can support you in capacity building in the communities and create a better one-stop shop. Again, thanks for being here today. I know I went a lot longer than I needed to. I need to hand it over to John because he has the meat of our discussion today. But I can tell you that we are all passionate about this and are very excited to be here with you today.
Hey, thanks, Brian. And that's pretty exciting that you're unveiling some new resources there, and hopefully that'll be complimentary and useful to our attendees. And I see we've got a little over 150 folks joining us here on the call, so appreciate them taking the time out of their day to be with us. And again, thanks for your opening remarks here. Why don't we ask our attendees, this is optional, but if you'd like to provide some additional input, both to guide today's discussion as well as the IWG itself. Here we have a poll question where we're basically saying, what are the real, top challenges for you in terms of facing the transition? Is it, identifying federal funds, which is sort of point A. Point B is, do you have the capacity to access those, whether through grant writing or otherwise? Do you need matching funds? Something that we've heard over and over again, along with capacity, is the ability to provide cost share against those federal resources. Option D is don't know where to go or who to contact to ask agencies. To Brian's final point, please do reach out to us. I'll drop my contact information into the chat, and you can really reach out to anyone at the IWG or any of our agencies that are part of it, and we would love to help you out in whatever you need there. Item E, we have not enough direct contact with federal agency staff, something that we're thinking a lot about in terms of various agency field staff and how they can play a role with direct engagement that really sustains beyond an individual event. Point F, too many funding opportunities or deadlines to keep track of. As Brian mentioned, the energycommunities.gov website will be a clearinghouse of the federal funding opportunities that are relevant to energy community stakeholders. And we'll certainly have deadline information in there as well, so you can filter on that. But we get that there is a lot, and it's really too much to ask to navigate all of that. And so we're going to try to minimize that barrier by having a one-stop shop of federal funding opportunities with hopefully some mechanisms to filter that and really hone in on exactly what you're looking for to make that easier. And then finally, if you have anything else that's a major challenge for us, please drop it in the chat. We'd love to hear your thoughts. So with that, why don't we go ahead and see the poll results? And there we are. So we see sort of a tie for, maybe it's a three-way tie almost. Don't have error bars here on A, B, and C. So need help identifying the federal funding, need support with the grant writing, and then the cost share matching. So pretty consistent, particularly on items B and C, the capacity and the cost sharing. And hopefully we'll help you out a little bit with item A today and into the future. So thanks everybody that did fill out this optional poll. We really appreciate it. It's going to be helpful moving forward. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar, slides and resources will be available afterwards, and those will be on the website, and we will send those out. Additionally, please do go ahead and drop any comments you might have in the chat along the way so that we can use those to inform the program. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce our keynote speaker. We've got John Grosshams together. He's a senior advisor with the Environmental Protection Agency, and really the ideal speaker for today's topic of where to get started. John is with the EPA's Office of Policy, and he supports their implementation of executive orders related to coal and power plant community revitalization, workforce development, and supply chains. John previously worked with the White House Detroit Federal Working Group to support Detroit's revitalization during the municipal bankruptcy, and also has worked on Midwest industrial communities, and I think is well known in this arena with respect to community-led economic revitalization. So without further ado, why don't I hand it over, John, and take it away.
Thank you, Brian and Briggs, for that introduction and for your leadership in general with the Interagency Working Group. Hopefully folks can hear me, and this is coming through with the presentation right now because I'm excited about this conversation. At the Environmental Protection Agency, I work within the policy shop in the administrator's office, and we are part of the supporting cast for the Interagency Working Group, like Brian mentioned earlier. And I'm really excited for today because I get to wear my EPA hat, but also my city planner hat. And I think that the question today of where to start is a great question for a lot of communities. Brian mentioned earlier that a lot of places are starting to think about how this energy transition looks on the ground. And the goal for today is really to start talking about how do we put together some of the initial steps to maybe get after some of those other resources that might be helpful for a longer term transition. I love the poll question that we just saw of where people's heads are at right now, and it's really interesting to see what people are thinking about for what their immediate needs are. I think we're going to cover a lot of those topics today. This question of where to start is also pretty relevant because a lot of times the energy communities that are looking to reposition their economic engine are doing so for the first time. A lot of communities haven't necessarily had to go through this process in the past. And so I can look at the questions and see that there's a lot of interest in, where are the resources? How do people figure out how to write that initial grant? How to do that initial step? And if people have those questions, it's not surprising because a lot of times when you have that long time economic industrial engine of the community start to shift, there's a lot of questions that come up for the first time. There's not necessarily a playbook or a guidebook for how to do this. And so I think that the poll is really helpful in seeing where people are interested in learning more. I think we're going to get there today. For my part, I've worked in a lot of Midwestern communities that have worked on how do they reposition their own site, community, entire city, region in the face of a changing economy, whether it's automotive, whether it's energy communities, or whether it's some other type of shift in the economy and what their backbone is for the community. A lot of folks ask, why now? There's a lot of long-term trends that are happening with regard to energy transition. There's a lot of communities that have been shifting for quite some time, and there's a lot of things happening in life. So why are we talking about this today? And I like to point out that yes, there's a couple of energy trends that are happening right now, and we'll talk about those in a second. But really, it's the bottom line on the chart here that we're seeing a lot of new momentum. Brian just mentioned a second ago that we've got new resources available on the interagency website. And I would say that the engagement from the federal government, the federal coordination is new. This is something that didn't exist 2 years ago. The resources are new. A lot of folks look at the idea of federal resources being the same every year, kind of year in, year out, and that is true to some extent. But there's a lot of new targeted resources for energy communities that are transitioning, and also existing resources that are looked at within that light of an energy community. And there's also, I think this will get to that capacity building question, there's additional support that's coming online as well to help communities think about how do you make that first step happen, and how do you get that first resource in hand. So I think that the trends are fairly well known. We know that there's a lot of power plants that are retiring in the near future. We know a lot of communities have already seen this trend take place in their own community. Might not be all at once. Oftentimes it's a single generating unit at a time as an energy plant slowly winds down and finds other fuel sources for pushing those electrons around the grid. But what I also see in these trends are community impacts. What is the host community or that region going to be doing as far as the site is concerned, the community is concerned, or the neighborhood, and how do we think about that particular impact as well? Oftentimes, I think people's brains go immediately to the energy. We know where we're going to source our electricity from, or how are we going to get the power that we need. But the community aspect isn't necessarily first in mind. And I think that a lot of times this is where communities' heads are at. I think we're seeing that in the poll. And this is important because not only are we seeing this trend happen over time, but we're actually seeing an acceleration right now. So we're seeing headlines, and we're not just seeing data, although it's helpful to see data. We're seeing a lot of headlines in the news about utilities that are expediting, they're accelerating their transition. They're looking at a timeline that maybe was 15 years, now it's going to be 10 years or 5 years. In the energy world, this is a big change. And for a lot of communities that are hosts to energy production, it's coming lightning fast. So we want to make sure that these resources, these conversations are happening now, because we don't want to lose any time in helping communities make this transition. And just when I talk about acceleration, just in the last year, what we've seen is a lot of utilities look at how they are planning to make energy in the future and how their fuel sources are going to shift. And this graph shows just in the last year that a lot of them have accelerated how they will do their retirements. So power plants that were going to retire at some longer point in the future are now going to be retiring sooner. A lot of utilities are undergoing this shift. So if you've seen it in your local news and you feel like this is something that's impacting you and your community and your region, you're not alone. It's really a national trend, and it's something that is certainly happening in a lot of places right now. And that really raises the question of, well, if the fuel is shifting from one source to another, what does that mean for all the people, places, and communities that host these energy sites? And that's really the focus of what the working group is trying to tackle, is how do we directly support this transition and the people that are impacted, the places that are impacted. Brian already gave a great intro on a lot of the work that the federal government has put together. I'll just mention again that the report that was put out is one great source of information. I think that gets at one of those poll questions of those resources. Where do you find them? It's a nice one-stop shop that was put out a couple of months ago. The other new news that we just heard is the availability of the website that also can point people to new resources that basically distills what was in that report and updates it a little bit to make sure things are current and available to people that are interested. I'm going to show this map one more time because I want people to realize that the impacts are not equal. This is not a situation where the transition that's taking place is felt equally across the country in all places. This is not a case where the peanut butter is being spread evenly across the country. It's lumpy, and it's showing up in certain places where you've got cumulative impacts. I grew up in the Midwest, and I like to describe it as a lot of coastal places, no hurricanes. They have a disruption that is a disaster. It takes place temporarily. I feel like in a lot of parts of the country, we've had a decades-long hurricane of shifting economies. And this is just part of that changing economy that a lot of places have been dealing with. And that's why it's important to think about, how do those resources get to more places, more funding, more quickly, as Brian had in his earlier slide, because that's really what this is all about, is making sure that those places that are feeling the impacts are able to access funding. And we're going to really talk about just that first series of steps. How do you get to that first bucket of funds? It's one thing to think about a total transformation overnight. We know that's not the case. There's a lot of initial steps that have to take place. So just showing a quick image of what continuum of change might look like, where you've got, we're starting with questions. Where do we have questions? How does it turn into ideas? Small change solutions, bringing in the network, looking at data, bringing it to elected officials and greater stakeholders, and eventually getting to that larger pot of money, the big dollars, something that's going to really change the community. A lot of times people don't realize that it takes a number of small steps to get to that first big check, whether it comes from the federal government, the state government, some other entity, or if it's just redevelopment from the private sector. It's not something that happens instantly or overnight. And so it takes a lot of small buildup to get to that point. And of course, once you have that first initial investment, then you can start seeing those physical changes in the community, and people can actually see things that are shifting physically in their neighborhood. The power plant that was the corner of Church and Main, that's been there for all their lives, might not look the same once you see some reinvestment taking place in that property. And that's really something that people will understand is now the transition is underway. So how do we get there? And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is the first couple of steps. The questions: how do you take a good idea and get that funding for it? And then how do you also kind of figure out where those initial, maybe smaller change funding opportunities lie that you can take advantage of to get to those bigger resources down the line? I would start off by saying that a lot of these initial steps are conversations. It's communication. And thankfully, communication doesn't cost anything to start with. And one of the most important relationships is between the community and the utility. I'm going to speak a little bit to power plants specifically, because I know some of the speakers coming on later will be covering coal mining country and some of the coal mining workforce changes that shift with the coal mine closures, or some sort of shifting economy with coal mines. So I want to hit the power plants up front. And I think that utility conversation is really important, because this is where a lot of the questions come from. When you see in the news that there is going to be retirement or some sort of shift in the power or the fuel generation in that plant, a lot of questions. And it's important that the local governments, whether it's the county, the city, it could be a city council person or a county board member that's host to that power plant, how do you get those questions answered? And so having those open lines of communication with the utility is really important. You're going to have questions on the timeline, the details of what's involved. There's going to be vocabulary challenges between a utility that probably speaks in energy and pushing around electricity in the grid with the community that probably speaks more tax revenue, jobs, and community development. And so how do you kind of reconcile those differences in language and make those connections happen? It's communication. One of the other questions that really comes up quickly is financial impacts. When is this impact going to hit that community? How do you understand the tax implications? It could be direct jobs. It could be indirect jobs in the community. There's a lot of questions that come up, and the conversations with the utility are incredibly important at these early stages. On the city side or on the county side, local governments have the ability to look at what this might mean for their own financial impacts, for sure, but what's the landscape? What's the physical land use going to change? Is it going to impact neighborhoods? Is it going to offer opportunities for some sort of redevelopments in the future? A lot of times power plants are in strategic locations for a reason. They're on waterfronts. They're near other adjacent businesses. They have a history of being in a particular place and other things that have grown up around them. The redevelopment opportunities might be something that offers some new take on how the industrial engine might continue in the community, but it's going to take some change to shift that focus from energy production to some other use. And so there's going to be a lot of planning and other activities that might need to take place on behalf of the city or the county to make those happen or unlock that potential. I think these are a lot of the questions that are out there right now. And when you've got these questions swirling, it's really hard to figure out where do you make that first step? How do you have that first conversation? So I want to just pick apart a little bit the utility community relationship. And I think a lot of people understand the community side because we're all residents of a place. And so on the upper left-hand corner, I put some of the key roles within a local community that are really helpful to this shifting, this transition. So of course, you've got your executives, you've got your county board, you've got your mayor, you've got your city manager, you've got people that are leading the community through these changes day in, day out. We've also got a lot of supporting casts. So we have public works, planning, environment, outreach and engagement, and they have their staff. It could be individuals on this chart. It could be the whole group that work with this conversation with the utility. Oftentimes it might start as a single line of communication, executive to executive, the mayor, the board member to the utility executive, just talking initially, what's this going to mean for the community? And then bringing in more people over time. On the utility side, it's helpful to understand that the utility is also got its own infrastructure internally. So they've got power generation folks that are concerned about where the next set of power needs are going to be, how are they going to be met? You got the distribution folks who are worried about the grid, and then the supporting services, in particular, the asset group. So how does the power plant see the power plant, the surrounding area, other utility assets, and how are they planning to dispose or to realign those particular assets? Incredibly important conversations that are taking place at the sub-CEO or sub-director level within the utility. And of course, their intergovernmental folks, incredibly important as allies and sources of communication to the local community. So these types of conversations can start off simply, they can evolve into more team conversations and hopefully do. And a lot of this doesn't cost anything as an initial step. These were a lot of the questions are going to get answered to figure out your next set of steps. And I know a lot of communities, they see the news and they see it as kind of like a one-time thing. You know, the power plant is going to be retiring. It's usually not overnight. It's not like a light switch where you just flick it on or flick it off. It is a process that takes place over many years. Just understanding the timeline for that is incredibly important. Again, when is the financial impacts going to take place? Is it all at once? Is it going to step down as operating units come off or as people work in different parts of the utility infrastructure? What is the land use going to look like as it changes? Will there be an increase in trucks or shipping? Will there be a decrease? When's that going to take place? When is the land ultimately going to be something that might be repurposed either for another energy reuse or whether it's going to be something entirely different? All those timeline questions are going to come up. So just on the screen here, we can see a little bit of what does that decommissioning process look like, and what does that shift look like. So it's not just a quick shutdown. It's really a very kind of thoughtful and direct way of changing the utility's function from power generation to something else. One other immediate question that comes up is that shift? Is this power plant going to shift to coal-fired to natural gas? Is it coal-fired to some other type of fuel source? That's important to know, and it's important to understand. What are the implications of that shift? When's that going to take place? What needs to be cleaned up is always a question as well. Is this something that is going to be cleaned up in a way that is focused on the buildings, the entire site? Where is that going to take place and how? And we're ultimately, I think a lot of communities are looking at, what becomes of this long term? If it's not the power plant at the corner that we've all known for our lives, what is it going to be? And starting to think critically about where new ideas come from, what can the market absorb, and what type of steps, initial steps, are needed to figure out where to go. So just to look at this a little bit differently, as far as a timeline, I'm speaking mostly to the early stages here. So before we get to that decommissioning we just talked about, what do we do when we're first notified or we first get this idea that, hey, there's something shifting with this power plant? There's a lot of work that can take place right up front. It doesn't need to wait and shouldn't wait until the plant has closed. At that point, we're in a pretty perilous situation here. You can see from this quick timeline, when you've got the power plant generating energy and you've got the utility solely focused on it as a core producer of energy, it is front of mind for them. Once it is shut down, it's being decommissioned, it's transitioning, it's part of that asset group of figuring out what to do next, that's the moment when it's not necessarily the top priority for the utility to think about anymore, but it is the top priority for the community, because that's still something that could be an economic engine long term. So that's the moment you want to look at as the critical moment to get past. You want to get past that closure and into that revitalization or redevelopment as soon as possible. And that's why it's really helpful to make use of every day, minute, hour that you have in that run up to the decommissioning or to the shutdown, to make sure that you can plan for that shift, knowing that it's coming, plan for that redevelopment, even though it might be a long ways off, and a lot of the initial steps that come with it. So let's pick apart a little bit of what can happen in the near term. And I think this is really the whole point of the webinar today, is just how do you take those first steps? It's not necessarily going to be going after a giant oversized check, although it could be. A lot of times it's simpler than that. So I want to just pick apart what can a utility do, what can a community do, and then what can other third parties do. We're going to hear from some of those people later on in our panel today, which is fantastic. So in the pink dots, this is just a list of kind of what is the utility doing ahead of this transition. Of course, they're thinking about their power generation. That's what they do. That's what they're here for. It's power. And they put a lot of their plans in motion years ahead of time. So this is something that goes before the utility board. And this is something that might be having its own public conversation, but it's largely focused on energy and fuel and how does that energy need of the future get met from different fuel sources. That doesn't necessarily speak to what are the community impacts or what does that community have to do. It's really focused on the power. So other plans need to focus on the community impacts and what can that community transition look like. Sometimes the utility steps up right away and they say, we are going to be doing a job transition plan. We're going to be identifying how all those workers that are assets of the company can remain assets of the company in a different context. It could be a transition at that same particular plant. It could be a transition within the utility infrastructure itself, different plant, different type of operation. Utilities want, I think, to keep good, well-trained workers on board so they can use them in other parts of the operation. It makes a lot of sense. And so they oftentimes will do this job transition plan as part of this transition. One thing that's a little bit less common is a host community plan. So how does that utility support the host community during this transition? Sometimes they speak of this in their overall shift of their power generation plan. So the utility board might hear that a utility is planning to do this type of transition with the community. It might take place over a number of years with different levels of support. Oftentimes communities are civic boosters themselves. They are part of the community. They are doing a lot of work with the community, and they want to make this plan part of that natural transition. But it's helpful to have it articulated as such, that they have a community plan, that they're supporting the community. Another thing that utilities are doing, of course, the shutdown decommissioning, typically very technical, not necessarily community focused, but there's a lot of impacts or implications from that plan that the community should be aware of. So it's helpful to know what's the plan as part of that decommissioning. And then ultimately disposition. What's this going to be? Is this going to be another utility asset? Is this going to be something that the utility holds on to? And they shift from coal-fired power plant to some other type of energy generation? Or is this something else entirely? Is this the new opportunity to do some sort of waterfront redevelopment on a really strategic site? Or is this something that this utility doesn't even know what they want to do yet, but they got to figure out what they're going to redevelop this as in the future? On the city side, And this is where I think we got a lot of the audience here today, is what is the city able to do ahead of time? The city, the county, the neighborhood, not powerless. And there's a couple key roles. So one, understanding the impacts. This is something that isn't necessarily going to be explained to the community right away in the detail that's needed. So you got to have those open lines of communication with the utility on scheduling, what are the impacts going to be. One of the key questions is that financial impact. When and how and where is that impact going to be felt? One of the steps that can also be done besides just being informed on that is getting organized as a city. I had those two org charts showing the city and the utility earlier. What is the city and county? What are the points of contact? Is it the city manager that's going to take on this transition over time? Is it going to be the public works director, the planning director that see this as their challenge and are appointed to when people have questions? Just pointing out who to contact is an incredible first step for any local community. And it's really helpful too for going after federal resources. We'll get after that in a second. Just identifying, not even doing it, just identifying what are some of the planning steps that are needed, the phases. What do you do first, second, and third? This is again where like these swirling options can make it very hard to make a decision initially. Just understanding what might need to be done upfront versus something that might need to happen later for redevelopment planning. Just knowing that before decisions are made, for instance, on how that power plant is going to be redeveloped, can be really instrumental in figuring out what do you do with the planning. Of course, if we are talking about redevelopment, inevitably there'll be zoning impacts, there'll be ordinances that can be passed. There could be a transition that takes place within the planning and redevelopment within that entire neighborhood. Oftentimes, power plants are not islands. They're usually connected to their neighbors, whether it's an industrial neighbor, other types of commercial neighbors. They're usually in strategic locations. So how do you think about that entire waterfront or that entire industrial district and think about how that transition can take place? Demolition planning is another thing that if you go down that road of having some sort of redevelopment, you can start thinking about what do you need to do to plan for that as well. If you need to update ordinances or practices, now is the time to do it before it becomes time to actually do the construction or demolition. I mentioned third parties as well. And this is, I think, where we're going to hear a little bit more on how the community at large can be helpful. So you can have a point of contact at the city or county. You can have staff who are working as a team within the city or county. They'll be talking to the utility, having a lot of conversations. A couple things that can happen more broadly. Community Transition Committee, Revitalization Committee, could be focused on the plants, could be focused on the broader neighborhood. So I think a lot of times these plants unlock potential for other areas to think about, well, what do the adjacent properties do? What's their future look like? If we can define this future together and do it as a whole, sometimes there's more opportunity that comes with thinking about an entire neighborhood versus thinking about a single site. So having a number of community members, civic boosters, people that can engage early and be assembled to start thinking about this, including where do you go after the funding, is really helpful. Another kind of low-cost first step is reaching out to the local university to figure out how do you engage that architecture, planning, engineering department, get them focused on this site, start talking about how would you divide the site if you had to redevelop it? What would you do if you have to do some sort of new power plant and you have some extra land that you're working with? What might be a good co-location opportunity for either another industrial source or another commercial source or another type of use entirely on that particular property? Student teams are great for getting the ball rolling. They bring in new ideas. They can assemble people together to have conversations that they wouldn't have otherwise had. They're not going to come up with the answer. They're not going to deliver specs or deliver some sort of baked idea for what the plant can become, but they're good at starting conversations. And they're also something that you might have locally that you can access and put on the ground pretty quickly. Foundations, and we're going to hear about this in a little bit too, foundation engagement. Where are foundations already engaged in the community? How might this fit in within their portfolio of what they're already doing? Foundations usually have a sweet spot. They could be focused on workforce. They could be focused on education. They could be focused on other types of housing issues. There's a lot of things foundations can focus on. Raise this challenge to them. How can this energy transition be part of a different foundation approach or their existing approach? Where are they working? This is all good fodder you can bring up early within the foundation community, oftentimes just by showing up at their quarterly meeting. They've got a community foundation gathering on a regular basis. This is an opportunity. Maybe it's the point of contact. Maybe it's the committee chair. Maybe it's a whole team that shows up, talks to the foundation community about where they're at, and alerts them to this shift that's going to happen. How can they play a role, especially early on? Can they support some sort of change early? Maybe they help with the grant writing. They put in a grant writer support elements to support eventual change down the line. Foundations are really good, honestly, listening to where the local community's needs are right now and supporting those needs. That's why they're here, and that's why they do such a great job of supporting communities during this transition. Other things you could do is bring in commercial development experts to talk about where do they see this site going or this community. They can tell you about the assets they see that you might not see. When you pass the same site every day and you see it just as a power plant, what does that site look like to a developer who sees it a little bit differently for the first time? Are there different opportunities that come from that type of engagement? At EPA, we've done that a number of times with, frankly, sites that didn't look so great. There are sites that had a lot of blights, a lot of challenges on them. Bringing in a fresh set of eyes is sometimes helpful to talk about what this site could become, where they see the challenges as well. Having experts come in can be helpful because they can sometimes shoot you straight on what you need to improve. It could be that the entire neighborhood needs improvement along that particular stretch of roadway. It could be that the single site needs help. It could be that there are other pieces that need to be unlocked. And they also might be helpful for developing that prospectus or that first level plan that the community is going to put together eventually to reposition that property. And then finally, I mentioned this last, but it really happens first, it's the public engagement. The questions that the community is going to raise are all the same questions that everyone's got on that team. So having conversations publicly, city, county, with the utility, what's going to happen over time, incredibly important. And to the extent that there can be frequent repeat conversations so the public knows how they can get answers to the questions is really helpful. A lot of times utilities do this for their power generation, but they don't necessarily do it for the community transition. And it's the community transition where there's so many questions. And so it's really helpful to stand up some sort of public engagement process that's going to be informative to people. What's happening first, second, third? When is it going to happen? What's the impact? Let me give a few examples here to start winding this up. When we pull it all together, we take a lot of those initial steps because we're trying to pull together a picture of what can happen for this transition at the site level, the neighborhood level, and the community level. And so pulling together a lot of these questions is helpful as single steps that we can start working on. And that's one of the funding opportunities that exists for communities right away, is that plan. What can happen as a strategy to either look at that site, look at the community as a whole, look at the region, and figure out how are you going to support this transition over time. And that's one of the reasons why I think that Brian's announcement earlier about the new funding that's on the street, the collection of that on the interagency website is really helpful because you can go after this type of funding for these strategies as an initial step. And especially if you have some of these early steps complete, that's really helpful. Just going to call out a few examples here of where this resource and power plants connection has been made. Here's an example from Lansing. A lot of times power plants have tremendous unique assets. And so you've got tall ceilings, you've got big rooms. It's a challenge. It's also an opportunity for what do you do with that particular site. Here's an example from Lansing, Michigan, where it was a utility turned into what became an office building for a large insurance headquarters. So this one example of where brownfields funding was able to play a role in that. Another example from Michigan for the planning was a brownfields project that looked at the area around the power plants. Power plant's located on the right. We called it the donut hole. The power plant was still operating. We knew it was going to be eventually winding down. How do we get the extra land around the power plants to be thinking about repositioning that land as a whole and thinking about some of the assets that could be put into play in that area. Pennsylvania's done a really nice job as a state of supporting some of these transitions with their own playbooks. I think this is a really helpful example to see how do you look at a site as an investment opportunity? What can it become? What are the unique assets of that site? How does that change over time? There's a lot of these that are available in different places. And I think that these playbooks are one thing that federal resources can support over time. One of the EPA programs I just want to highlight because it's open right now, Brownfields grant season is now. So if you have environmental issues on a site, adjacent to a site, in the community, it's a good time to think about how do you get money in hand now, and especially upfront, because you know you're going to need that funding later on. So thinking now about where those resources might be employed is really helpful. And the applications are due come December. And this is also another resource that's available on the website right now for folks that are thinking about how they might tackle some of those environmental challenges. So this is one final takeaway. A lot of times, it's not going to be a giant check all at once. It's going to be a series of steps. And all those dots, all those individual actions, and some of which we're going to hear about in a second, they add up to that pitch, or they add up to the application. And so if you're kind of concerned about how do you put the application together, pulling all these dots into it, public engagement, the point of contacts, the standing up of the committee, the utilities city engagement, you put those into any grant application, regardless of its Department of Energy, Environmental Protection Agency, Economic Development Administration, Housing and Urban Development. It doesn't matter. They all want to see some of the same qualities. They want to see momentum. They want to see a city that's already started putting things together to have some sort of plan in place, even if it's not a formal plan, just to have a strategy. And this is how you can get after those funding opportunities later on. So I'll end there, but I really want to encourage folks to think about how they can put together some of these initial steps to go after those federal resources, no matter what type they are, what color of money it is, to take that next step and launch that strategy. So with that, I'll turn it back to Briggs.
Yeah, hey, thanks, John. That was great. I really liked how you laid out the timeline and how there's a lot of individual steps that ultimately culminate in that funding opportunity or whatever that major milestone is along the journey. You provided us with some playbooks and some EPA funding opportunities, and really lifted up that there are a lot of considerations, whether it's from the utilities, the communities, and just everybody else that's involved. You know, clearly there's workers involved. So, you know, just thanks so much for that keynote. All right. Well, with that, why don't we transition to our panel? First up, we have Kurt Oldfield of Spoon River College in Canton, Illinois. And just a little bit of background on Kurt. He's the president of Spoon River College in Canton, Illinois, and has been since 2012. The college was established in 1959 and is in west central Illinois, somewhat near Peoria, if you're familiar. And Kurt is a leader within Canton, serving as a board member of the Canton Area Chamber of Commerce, president of the Rotary Club. And we've invited him today specifically to learn a little bit more about their experience with transition, a couple of coal plants, and ultimately providing some local training and educational opportunities for coal plant and mine workers. So with that, why don't we go ahead and have Kurt share a few thoughts with us. Thanks, Kurt.
Thank you, Briggs, and thank you to the Interagency Working Group for the invitation to present today. Certainly appreciate being able to share our experience to help others learn from our experiences and hopefully improve your experience as some of these coal-fired power plants start to close down across the country. Just to give you a little bit of background and an overview of Spoon River College, we are a community college that serves west central Illinois. Where I have that orange box is from the map that you saw from John earlier. We're just north of that green circle for the Illinois Basin. So we're just a little bit north. The reason why the Illinois Basin is identified there is because it not only has a large number of coal-fired power plants, but it's still also got some active coal mines in the far southern part of Illinois. And so we are just outside of that official designation, but we had 2 power plants that closed in the latter part of 2019. To give you an idea, I think I saw some questions in chat about rural and poor areas. We certainly cover both of those categories. Unfortunately, right now we have about a 13% poverty rate in our area with about an 8% unemployment rate. And so we too feel that pain, just like I think was expressed in one of the chat conversations before, but really want to stress a lot of what John was talking about in terms of planning. It was unfortunate for us that we didn't have a lot of time to plan. Vistra Energy owned both of the two coal-fired power plants that are in our service region. Duck Creek, which is in Canton, Illinois. Both of these power plants sit right on the Illinois River, in between the Illinois River and the Mississippi River. Duck Creek was about a 441 megawatt power plant. When you look at their tag, and Havana was about 488 megawatts. They employed about 300 employees altogether, most of those being either steamfitter union jobs and or IBEW jobs. What really started the conversation for us, and John talked about in his keynote presentation, was really starting to convene a group together. We heard rumblings unofficially about Vistra closing the Duck Creek power plant first. And so the school superintendent and I started to meet, and it wasn't over our altruistic ideas, but it was more about the impact of property tax. For Spoon River College, that ended up being about $300,000 a year that we received from property tax from the Duck Creek power plant. For the Canton School District, which is a medium-sized school in Illinois, they received over $1 million of property tax directly from that power plant. And so we started to think about the fiscal implications first, and then that evolved as we confirmed the rumor to be true. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide about what happened after that. So we were officially notified by Vistra in late August of 2019 that the power plant was going to close. We just had the Remembrance Day for the Havana power plant closing. It closed on October 29th of 2019. The Canton Duck Creek power plant officially closed December 1st of 2019. And so all of those 300 plus employees were without work in that period of time. So roughly a 4-month stretch. They went from full-time employees with full-time benefits to no work, and about a 60 or 90-day transition period for them to find work. So we immediately went to work to help find those employees positions or career plans that were associated with the power plants. Really, it was a struggle for us because of that short timeline, because as you might imagine, from a humanistic side, there's a shock. Many of the workers knew something was happening. None of us anticipated it happening as fast as what we had talked about. So what John had talked about in his previous slides are a more ideal situation in which you may have years to prepare for a power plant closing. And unfortunately, we did not. So what we did is we put together a team of rapid response individuals that were from the college, but also from our Regional Workforce Investment Board. I just want to spend a little bit on the importance of that. The Regional Workforce Investment Board is a board from the state of Illinois. Every state has some similar kind of concept that gets its funding from the U.S. Department of Labor. The key to that is you really have to start at the state level to start to shift those funds. And so what we did is utilize the employee or dislocated worker fund through the Regional Workforce Investment Board to help offset their costs of either going back to school at our community college, at a neighboring community college, or at a public 4-year university, depending on what their career goals were. So in order for us to establish that, we met with workers on all 3 shifts, because as you might imagine, this power plant ran 24/7. So we met on all 3 shifts, tried to meet either prior to a shift starting or as a shift was concluding. And we met 4 different times. So we met in September, twice in October, and once in November with those groups. So what we then did is we evaluated the current education and training levels that those employees had. We discussed their career goals, their aspirations, held employer hiring fairs where we brought in employers who were looking for employees that had the skill set that was displayed by these impacted employees. We held college open houses to help those employees find their career path if they were switching out of the power generation career path that they were currently on. And then finally, we connected them with community resources, and that's really important. So it reinforces a lot of the bullets that John had displayed in terms of it really takes a lot of people once a power plant is concluded. Now, this was at both power plants that we were doing this because both power plants sit within that. So the results that I'm going to share with you are from both of those power plants that were represented by Spoon River College. About 60% of those employees went into another power plant that's in pretty close proximity to where these two closed coal generation power plants were at. And most of those were IBEW, so they were able to transfer or bump based on their seniority. The challenge that we see coming down the line is Illinois just adopted a new energy management plan. Its legislature did here just a few weeks ago that has calls for a complete shutdown of all coal generating power plants by 2035. So in 14 years, every power plant will be closed that burns coal for its power generation in Illinois. So what we're doing is kicking the can down the road. We're seeing that we have IBEWs who have bumped into other jobs or other classifications within other power plants, only to know that within 14 years, all of those power plants that are coal-fired power plants are going to close. About 20% of the workforce did enroll in a community college or a university to upskill or change careers. I've listed some of those career changes that they moved into. Commercial driver training was the highest. It was the quickest turnaround for us, so about a 6 or 8 week training program. Many of those individuals chose to go into those careers because they could finish our program quickly, go get their CDL license, and be either regional or over-the-road truck drivers and be able to be back in the workforce as quick as possible. An interesting transition that we had not prepared for, but it's been great for us to be able to integrate these impacted employees is in the nursing and health career. So we had a number of employees who had always had a desire to go into that field that we're now helping to start into that program. Also EMTs, there was an interest of a number of employees in that field to become an EMT or a paramedic. We had a few of those individuals who wanted to go into teaching, especially in the industrial arts teaching, which nationwide has a large teacher shortage. So taking their work experience and helping them achieve their teaching credential was a fun transition for our staff. Diesel repair was another area of interest, and so many of these individuals worked with their hands, and so we were able to enroll them into our diesel repair program. We also have a locomotive diesel program that is with Burlington, a partnership with Burlington Northern Santa Fe. And so those individuals were able to go through an 8-week training and move into the workforce with Burlington Northern Santa Fe and some of the other regional railroads in our area. As you might imagine, advanced manufacturing was popular among those impacted employees, and that included welding and our computer numeric control programs for advanced manufacturers in this area. Caterpillar used to call Peoria home. They recently moved to Deerfield, Illinois, but still have a lot of manufacturing impact just a few miles away from us that was able to hire some of those employees. The piece that John spoke about in his area is certainly highlighted here is that approximately 5% of the workforce went into their own business. And so I was really excited when we first started to work with these individuals that they really were interested in starting their own business, how they could create that. And we've had some successful businesses launched of impacted employees from these two power plant closings. As you might imagine, with both of these power plants being built in the late 60s or early 70s, about 50% of, or 15% of our workforce retired. either that or moved out of state or are unemployed. But the greatest majority of those individuals chose to take retirement as those power plants came to a close. We'll go ahead and switch to the next slide. One of the questions that was asked of us as presenters is to think about need or future considerations. John highlighted the important one, and that's time. We did not have a lot of time, so I would encourage you to follow John's advice from the previous presentation about really planning ahead, working with the utilities early to start the work to make the transition smooth. It was really abrupt for our region and had a reciprocating impact throughout our community as a small rural community. We really felt it hard. And so we lost a lot of good families that moved or that chose to take other options. And so time would have been nice to be able to plan ahead of time. Funds was my next bullet point, and that's really about keeping in mind that it's not just the employee, his or herself, that are impacted, but really the families. So we had students who were enrolled in college who had to drop because their expected family income dropped considerably, and this was all pre-COVID. So we saw a pretty strong decline because of family members, sons or daughters of employees who were enrolled in the college, whose lives then changed also because mom and or dad weren't able to pay for college moving forward. So considering that impact, I think is really important. We noticed a big challenge, and this is kind of a key takeaway for us, is the employee training record keeping. The Vistra did not have great records about the industry credentials that those individuals may have. In today's competency-based education, it would have been really nice to be able to have those credentials, the objectives that the employee had met in order to give them partial credit towards speeding up their college degree if that was applicable. And so really a key word out to the utility companies is to beef up that HR training and record keeping, and really having those industry credentials up to speed will help those employees transition a lot smoother. The final piece, as I talked about before, was the replacement or reduction of property tax. When a power plant closes, I gave you those numbers for us, and it only is going to be impacted when you're talking about coal mines or any of the others that take up large acreage or have a large infrastructure in place. That property tax implication on our K-12 school district, our county operating funds, our community college, really is felt now. This is our first taxing year that we've had a reduction of those. And so we've seen a 60% reduction this year. We'll go down to about 30% next year. And then the following year after that, we'll be at about 15 or 20% of the property tax we were receiving in 2019. So we were able to negotiate with the power company a step down property tax. But in Illinois, the utilities are charged by the amount of power that's generated. And so we could have gone from 100% to nothing. And so we were fortunate to be able to negotiate as a community with Vistra to step those property taxes down as we went along. I've got contact information here if you have questions about what we did in terms of making that transition or how we got community involved. I think there was a question early in the period about registration, and when we get to Q&A, I'll talk a little bit about how we pulled some of those people together that John recommended. So again, thank you to the IWG for inviting me to share our strategies, and I'm happy to be able to turn this over to Jerry from the Appalachian Kentucky Foundation, and she's going to walk us through some of those, the work that's being done in her region. So thank you again, Briggs, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Kurt, that's great. And thanks for teeing up, Jerry. I just wanted to acknowledge we've received multiple questions, which we'll get to after Jerry's presented specifically on how to access those funding. I think the dislocated worker grants in particular. So we'll return back and sort of double down on that information. But just a quick introduction for Jerry. She's the executive director of the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky. And today she's going to be talking a little bit about downtown revitalization, philanthropy, and just really sharing a lot of expertise and how she's been engaged in Eastern Kentucky for quite a while now. So without stealing any more of your time, Jerry, why don't you go ahead?
Great. Thanks, Briggs, for everyone for having me here today. We are a community foundation before anybody gets too excited about having a big philanthropist in the group. A community foundation is a public charity, just like I'm assuming many of you are. And the difference is we are legally designated as a community foundation, but the difference we have from most typical or historic community foundations is we didn't start our foundation to serve donors. We started this foundation to build a community that donors could then invest in. I heard someone earlier in the chat talk about being in a rural West Virginia community where they haven't quite given up on coal yet. We really see our work as that hearts and minds work. It's pulling people together in the community to say, whether you believe it's over or not, what do we believe in? What do we want to go for? And so that's, this is where we are. Here's our map. So if you look at the big red dot in the middle of the map, that is where we are located. We are actually sitting in downtown Hazard, Kentucky, which is right smack in the middle of the red counties in the southeastern corner of Kentucky. We're about 12 years old, so just to give you a little context, our poverty rates run in the 30% neighborhood. We serve all of those red counties by definition, but I will confess or admit that our work tends to focus on that bottom swath, those about 26, 28 counties that really run from the largest county there in the eastern corner over to the red counties on the central west side there. Our work was really started about 12 years ago by a group of nonprofit organizations that were located in these coal fields. And if you're like me, who have been working in these high poverty coal communities for a very long time, you know that when you're listening to a presentation like the ones we've had today, they're rich and there's lots of stuff there, but I find myself asking, who is the you? Who is the we? Who is who is the person, the place that's going to do this stuff, get the community engagement, do the work, do all the community building that has to happen to make these things work, do all the things that are on the list. So when we were created, the energy transition hadn't quite hit its stride, but we felt like it was coming. I heard Kurt say earlier, they kind of felt like they'd gotten some hints, some inklings. I think many of us in the coal fields were getting those inklings a long time ago, but really when things started to look like there was going to be that fall off of the cliff instead of the steady decline, a bunch of nonprofits in our region came together and started thinking about what are we doing? We're all operating in a bunch of silos. Who's going to do this when we die? Who wants to work this hard on one thing and never feel like we're actually plugging up the dam? We just keep pulling people out of the river. No one was really holding that bigger vision of what do we want across our region. So in 2008, 2009, 6 business leaders, many of them from the coal industry, and one nonprofit organization that volunteered as the host, and a $5,000 contribution said, we're going to do something different. We're going to start this community foundation. We're going to figure out how to pull all of this work together and hold that bigger vision. We literally Googled it and came up with the Aspen Strategies Group, Rural Development Philanthropy. And I put that resource is in the chat for you. but rural development philanthropy starts with people. And that was what was so critical for us. I think starting with the people, and you heard this before today, starting with people in our communities and what is it that the people in the community want for your community, not what's wrong with us, but what can we do? Where do we want to go from here? Whether the answer is coal or the answer is not coal, what do you want to see happening here in 20 years? So we asked a lot of those questions while we were just thinking about doing this work. And then after about 3 years of doing that, which was exhausting, and I don't recommend taking 3 years to do it, we launched the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky with a pledge of $50,000 a year for 5 years and $100,000 in assets. We hold this vision. This isn't the vision that we are arrogant or we aren't arrogant enough to say this is everybody's vision for Appalachian Kentucky. We are saying this is the vision we are holding for our region, and anyone, an organization, a local government, an educational institution, any of our partners that want to contribute to this vision, we are here with some tools and some resources, some communication. We want to do whatever it takes with all of these partners to realize this vision in our communities. We want to hold ourselves accountable. Can you go back to the other slide, please? So the vision, we're holding this vision to keep ourselves accountable. There's 5 basic goals within this vision: to grow local economies, to support and prepare children and youth, to promote a positive regional vision, to reimagine and revitalize downtowns and community infrastructure, connect and strengthen local nonprofits, and then all of those 5 things together through fostering community leadership. Now let's take it to the next slide, where I want to tell you about our approach. And this is our approach. It's about relationships. It's not about money. Don't start with the money. Far too often, and throughout my history in working in nonprofit organizations, we look at these opportunities that are coming at us faster than we can read them. And we're trying to think, how can we use this money? How can we use this money? How can we use this money? But yet we haven't done the work to figure out what is it we want to do, and then say, what resources do we need to do that? And I know saying that at this point, while the federal government is shoveling money out the door, where things are happening really fast, it's hard to think that way. But I also believe firmly, and we hold, that if you start with the money, you may get a good ribbon cutting and a flashy project, but you are not going to get the sustainability you need and the buy-in you need from your community. So we are a foundation that carries a lot of resources that don't involve money. We think about our social capital. We think about our moral capital, our values. What are we espousing when we go out into a community? When we think about investing in a community, our intellectual capital. What do we know? What do we know about funding that's available? What do we know about donors who might be interested in contributing to something? Our reputation over time. We've been able to gain a reputation of being accountable and transparent because we're an accredited community foundation, and we worked real hard to get that accreditation right up front so that it would say to high net worth individuals or to foundations or to the federal government, we are accountable and transparent, and we have the capacity to do what needs to happen. So we're using all of that capital first, and then we're trying to find and work with our communities to find that financial capital. It's really all about the relationships. So on the next slide, it's really the meat of the work that we do. And we do 3 things. And earlier, when we opened this session, you saw 3 words on a slide: coordinate, catalyze, and target, which I looked at and thought, that's our theme. we build community first. Then we work on creating the capacity within that community to do what the community has decided are their priorities, has set out to do, has set their vision on that plays into this bigger vision. And then we look at the assets that it's going to take to get us there, including the financial assets. The community building happens by building several different ways. One way is we have a cohort of affiliate community foundations, and we stay as far behind or as in front of those communities as they need for us to be or ask us to be. So right now we're hosting a network of 8 community foundations in Appalachian counties in Kentucky, covering 12 counties. We have 1 regional foundation. And we're about to add 2 more, bringing us to 10 community foundations and 18 counties. Now that means all of those communities are hosting an accredited community foundation with a board of directors that engages people from across sectors in their community who are all learning, who are all building that capacity to do all of the things you've been hearing about today already, so that they are the they who are doing that preparation for plant closing. They are the they that is looking at all of the money that's getting shoveled out the door at USDA and thinking, which one of these applies to this plan that we have for our community? They are the they that are talking with us and then helping us look at the communities that surround them to think about how can we look at a bigger bucket that might serve several communities as opposed to one community competing with the next community. So that community building, getting people in the communities to work together to create the capacity it takes to do all of the things you've already been hearing about today. Once we have that in place, then we can put our assets to work. And our assets we have already put together all of those first assets of reputation and social and moral capital. Then we can bring the financial capital to it. I will tell you that we have demonstrated over and over again that money flows where there is a channel. We felt like and demonstrated over time that that is indeed true, that if you create a channel, if you think about a water tower and the pipes, which we are so short of in our region, if you create a bucket for money to flow, then we can channel that money and be the pipes across our communities that gets them the assets that they need to implement the work that they're doing. We've simply created that channel. Today, we have about $20 million in assets that we're holding. We're providing backbone support to 23 different initiatives going on across our region in various places. And we have those 8, soon to be 10, community foundations that we're providing back office support for. We've evolved with Aspen, and I know Briggs is up there because my time is up. I hate to go last. The resources are there. We didn't think this up. We put all of this together through a best practice called Rural Development Philanthropy. We're here to drive philanthropic and public resources out of the big cities and the coast and into Middle America. I'd be happy to talk to anybody offline.
Thanks, Jerry. That was great. I appreciate you sharing just a few insights and wish we did have more time. But we have had some great questions here, and I will invite John and Kurt to join me on the stage with Jerry. And while we're doing that, let's roll our final poll questions so that the audience can have a chance to give us a little bit of feedback. So let's go ahead and put that up as well. And so in the audience, this is optional, but if you'd like to give us a little bit of feedback, we'll use this for designing our additional programming. And the first question, Kurt, as I alluded to, I think folks would like to understand a little bit more about practically how you access the funding that you used for training workers. Can you tell us that?
Yeah, so Briggs, thanks for that question. What we were able to do is use the dislocated worker funds that are supplied from the U.S. Department of Labor to each state. Each state then allocates those funds. In Illinois, we had a regional workforce investment board who then applied for those funds and got those. Those went directly to the impacted employee to pay for their college-going expenses. And then they had a reporting mechanism for that. But those all center back to U.S. Department of Labor funds, but each state has the authority and the opportunity to apply those. So if you're in an impacted community, start with your Department of Commerce or Economic Opportunity or labor in your state, and you should have some kind of regional workforce board that applies those funds to the individuals.
That's great, Kurt. Thank you very much. And Jerry and John, I'm going to give you guys each 30 seconds with a question on community leadership. It's often called out as being a really important factor, and I just wanted to give you a final word here, 30 seconds. How can communities cultivate, recruit, or convene leaders, or otherwise, build capacity in communities? John, why don't you jump first?
Thanks, Briggs. Great question, because it comes down to leadership for that first step. So oftentimes that first step has to be the leader that moves the community forward. And thankfully that leadership doesn't cost much, but it can be hard to get. And so having that community leadership happen where you've got that committee forming and you've got that initial first set of steps to recognize that there is a challenge to be dealt with. I think that's where leadership lies. And then the other steps of going after money and other things can follow suit once you've had that first step made by local leaders.
Jerry, how about that?
I'll just add to that, leadership, we teach a lot of leadership, but leadership is really learned through demonstration and seeing what happens in your community. And our experience is that bringing the leadership of just local citizens working in partnership with local government, we're not quasi-governmental, we're not an educational institution, we are local people bringing voice to local government, but we put ourselves in a position of hosting those conversations and trying to increase the civil discourse. So I would just say leadership isn't forced or taught as much as it is demonstrated and has to be convened, and that's our biggest piece of our work.
Bringing people together. Well, hopefully we've done a little bit of that here today. Kurt, John, Jerry, thank you so much for sharing your insight and wisdom here. And to our audience, thank you for hanging in there. Still over 100 people on the call, an hour and a half in. So thank you so much for your engagement. I hope you've shared some frank feedback so that we can improve, and I really look forward to working with you moving forward. Thanks so much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.